Folks, welcome to the PIDE webinar. As you know, PIDE tries to bring you the best of research and thought around the world. And we try and bring you everything that we can to start to sort of inform the debate in Pakistan, to try and bring you speakers who will give you all manner of information, all sides of the spectrum, and try and, trying to teach you economics as well as things about Pakistan. So in that vein, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Steve Keen. Professor Keen has done very well in terms of developing a voice. He has become a major voice against neoclassical economics, and he's got sharp analyses and criticism of neoclassical economics. So those of you who are already fed up with neoclassical economics, you must hear what Steve Keen has to say. He has several books, the most famous of which is Debunking Economics, which is actually a wonderful read, very polemical and very interesting to read. Steve is also he also wrote a book called the Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis After the Global Economic Crisis? And it's a breezy read. It's a wonderful read. Really, really very interesting book. And I must say, I find myself, even though I'm of the neoclassical bent, I find myself in much agreement with Steve. Steve is also the recipient of the Revere Award by the Real World Economic Review. His main interests are complex systems approach to macroeconomics, which is something that I really like too, as well as he talks about climate change. He has many publications, over 100 publications in many different areas. I won't go into them, but he's a well-known academic. He's also been ranked 19th in the academic influence list of influential economics. He's designed many things, open source dynamics, for developing the Minsky model, which I talked to him a few years ago, but I must say, confess, I haven't seen the model. Steve, please send me the link. I'd love to see the model. He's also been a professor at the University of Western Sydney and Kingston University, London. Now, Steve is about to enter politics. He's already listed himself as the local candidate in New South Wales. So Steve is going to talk to us about neoclassical economics and its critique in terms of the Minsky model. So with that, I'll turn to Steve. Steve, why don't you give us your talk, and then we'll have an open discussion on that.
Okay. Sorry, my computer crashed. My computer crashed, and I had to go back out. So I've also lost screen sharing. So Nadeem, if you can enable share screening or screen sharing, I can get.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Let's go. Steve, I've already introduced you. Please, Mansoor Saab, screen sharing allow kare. Let's move. Steve, give your talk, and then we'll have a discussion after that. Okay. Yep, there it is. Let's go.
Okay. Okay. So, unraveling money and debt problems with Minsky. I'm now back getting people to admit into the room too, by the way, but I'll just do that quickly. Okay, so those are my websites, and Nadeem was mentioning my books earlier. So those are the major ones. I'll be working on a new one shortly, actually a new edition of Debunking Economics. And the final one I intend writing is called Principles of Political Economy and Ecology. And I hope to start that towards the end of next year. But what I'm talking about today is largely how money is actually created versus the delusions that mainstream economics has. And unfortunately, those are the delusions that still dominate how politicians and journalists and the public in general thinks about money. And that is, the government runs a deficit. It has to borrow from the private sector or foreign governments. That's the first proposition. And that's an unjustifiable burden on future generations. And the deficit is equal to the amount of debt that it needs to issue to finance its operations. And when they do their typical supply and demand thinking, this is the sort of diagram they draw. So they have supply and demand for a markup of loanable funds. Notice that it's a loanable funds model, and not endogenous money. And the extra demand from the government pushes out the demand curve. And what that means is, first of all, that's the deficit there, the increase in the amount of spending that's involved. And that pushes up interest rates. So you get higher interest rates, which crowds out private spending. And that's the way that the mainstream, and we must say in general, the financial sectors in general, that's how they think. And they're completely wrong. And I want to just show why that is by properly doing the accounting here. So let's go here. It's, as I emphasize that it says the loanable funds model. And this, by the way, this was written in 2016, 2 years after the Bank of England came out and said that model is nonsense. It doesn't actually apply to the real world. So there's been, this is not news. This has been argued for, if you go back to Schumpeter, you can go back to Pigou, you can go back even further than that and find people who talk about the banking sector creating money. But we were going blue in the face saying all this until the Bank of England came out and said it for us and said the reality of how money is created differs than the description found in some economic textbook, which is really in all economics textbook, except those written by a lot of people like myself. So rather than banks receiving deposits and lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. And there's also, they knock the money multiplier model. And the same thing happens with the Bundesbank, which also came out and said this is all nonsense. And I was just going to drop my hand up here, if I can. I'll leave it there, it's okay. So they said it's actually a book operation, and a bank's ability to grant loans has nothing to do with whether it has excess reserves or not. So all contradicting what the mainstream believes, but that hasn't changed how they think. And the basic attitude, well, you know, it's a more complicated model to say bank can create money. We'll stick with the old one because what's the difference? Well, the difference is that when in the old model they have, credit is not part of aggregate demand. But in the real world, and in the model I'm going to show you now, credit is both aggregate demand and income. And I want to explain that logically, first of all. So if you start from the essential macroeconomic identity that expenditure is income, whatever you spend becomes income for somebody else. So there's that relationship at the individual level applies at the aggregate level as well. Expenditure is income. And that's a lot of the reasons why mainstreamers decide not to worry about money, but they don't understand double entry bookkeeping and endogenous money as well. So I want to illustrate how this is correct and how we can show the role of credit, first of all. So I'm going to divide the economy into X individuals, X sectors. And if X was equal to all the individuals and firms in the government, this would capture all of GDP. But at the moment, I'm only capturing a fragment of it. And I'll show expenditure on the horizontal. So I'm going to have expenditure by one sector on the other two sectors. I'm going to have in this model households, services, and manufacturing. So expenditure by households goes neither services or manufacturing. Expenditure by services goes neither households or manufacturing. Expenditure by manufacturing goes on services or households. And therefore, each row necessarily sums to zero. And then what you can then show is the negative sum of the diagonal is aggregate expenditure, while the sum of the off-diagonal elements is aggregate income. So if we look at the simplest case of all, where there's no lending and no banking in that sense, just a fixed amount of money, then households spend $A per year on services and B per year in manufacturing, and the sum is zero. And the same for services, C on households, D on manufacturing, and then for manufacturing, E on households, F on services. And if you take the negative sum of the diagonal, that's aggregate expenditure. You take the sum of the off-diagonal elements, that's aggregate income. They're necessarily equal to each other. And you can get a difference in the individual sum of expenditure and income for an individual, but overall that sum is zero. So there's your basic identity. We start from that particular point. Now we look at the model of loanable funds. This is the myth that neoclassicals prefer to continue with, where one non-bank lends to another non-bank, and the amount is credit per year. So what I'm showing here is that service sector is lending credit dollars per year to the household sector. And because it's not a purchase, you show it diagonally. It's a transfer of money. It's not a purchase in that sense. So rather than the flows out of the services are C dollars going to household as before, but D minus credit dollars going to manufacturing, while credit dollars goes across to the household sector. So that's the basic logic there. Now, when you add up the negative of the diagonal, and I've left out actually one, I left out, I left out manufacturing on the table, it's my mistake, pardon me. But if you do your sum, what you find is that interest turns up, because interest is a transaction between the sectors. So interest is captured, but credit cancels out. There's a minus credit here, a plus credit there, minus credit here, plus credit there, in both directions. the amount of credit disappears. So in the loanable funds world, which is the world the neoclassicals think they live in, there is no role for credit in aggregate demand or income. But what about the real world, which is what I call it bank-originated money and debt, which is a better expression than endogenous money. There's a nice acronym of BOMD. So we take a look at that situation. And now we've got to look at is that, I'm just going to admit people from the waiting room, pardon me. What you have is that the bank lends credit dollars per year to households, and the households spend those credit dollars per year, and I'm showing this particular simple example, spend that money on manufacturing. So what you have is, in terms of the transactions on the liabilities and equity side of the banking sector ledger, which is the sum of money. This is money. Money is the sum of everything circulating here. But what you have is credit is paid, credit goes up here because there's an increase in the assets. So the assets of the banking sector rise, the liabilities rise as well. That creates credit dollars worth of debt and credit dollars worth of real money, which is then spent over here. So when you do your horizontal sum, credit does not cancel out. And when you do the off diagonals, rather, there's only one entry for credit. You do your diagonals, there's also one entry for credit. You do the logical sum, and credit is now part of both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. And that's what's being left out by the neoclassicals. They don't realize this. They think you can ignore the financial sector. And I saw David Andolfado making those arguments on Twitter in the last couple of weeks. So that's the basic logic as to why it matters to take a look at the level of credit, level of private debt, and so on. And what I want to do now is illustrate how you can see all this stuff by building a Minsky model, and you also get rid of all the nonsense of over the role of the government in creating money as well. So to create a Minsky model of the financial sector, you click on the banking icon there and place your bank on the screen. I'm now going to turn off the fact that it would display variables because that's a bit of a legacy factor that the variables are displayed on the banking icon, and open up the Godley table. And that's opening up my wrong screen here, so I'll bring it up. And the Godley table shows assets and liabilities and equity for any entity in the economy. So we're going to have banks having reserves. To the plus key, you create a new entry there. Banks having loans and banks having bonds. And I'm going to use one feature of Minsky, the fact that it uses latex commands to do formatting. So that's going to be subscript B when I click down here. And then you have deposits. And for a more complicated model, I'd break deposits into workers and capitalists, et cetera, but I'm just doing a very simple model here, so I'll leave that out. And then we have the banking sectors, banks, the equity of the banking sector. But those are my basic divisions. And let's say we've got, say, 100 in reserves, and say 1,000 in loans, and say 500 in bonds. Then I need to make the row consistent across the three sections there. So I'm going to say, well, let's say there's 1,200, I'll say 1,300 in deposits, and bank equity is 300. So what Minsky is doing is making sure that all rows sum to zero, which is an essential part of getting your logic correct. And we look at the very first operation of bank lending. Then what happens is banks lend credit dollars per year to the private sector, and they record an increase of credit dollars per year in loans. And that's all it is to say money endogenous. That's literally it. That's all you need to have to show that banks create money. I'll quickly show the neoclassical fantasy. Let's just imagine there's another group here called savers. Then what the neoclassicals see happening is I can drag this over here and say, well, it's money coming out of the savers account and going into the depositors account. And that's for their fiction. But the real world is that the loans increase the assets of the banking sector and increase the liabilities as well. That's how they create money. And that's simple little detail of what neoclassicals miss. I'll just quickly turn off showing the values until I get a bit more complicated here. That's bank lending. Pardon me, I clicked on the wrong part of my screen. What about the government running a deficit? Well, I'll just call it deficit spending by the government. So the government is spending deficit, but that actually, if it's a negative deficit, then it actually is a surplus. So I've got deficit here. Now what you can see immediately just by putting it in this way is the deficit creates money. Okay, this is the essential point that Stephanie Colton emphasizes in the deficit myth as well. The deficit, rather than being financed by borrowing from the private sector, literally creates the amount of money that the government is using for the deficit. That is the fundamental operation you need to understand. Understand those two lines, you understand the mixed credit fiat world in which we live. Now, that's our first two lines. What about paying interest? So interest on bank loans. Well, that I can show it in a more complicated way, but the basic idea is that you have interest you're paying on loans. I'm going to use the subscript of Minsky there to make that a bit better formatted, and that then increases the short-term equity of the banking sector. By the way, we also support long-term equity these days, but I won't go into that in this particular demonstration. So that's the basic. And what about interest? What about bonds? Well, when the treasuries sell bonds, what you have is they are actually bought by the banks. So the Treasury sells bonds to the banks, and I'm using the superscript as well. So bond sales by the Treasury to the banks uses the reserve which have been created by the deficit. And then what that means is the banks then get an increase in their holding of bonds by that purchase. So what you have is a conversion of money from being backed by reserves, which the banks can't trade, and there's no interest normally paid on reserves, to bonds, which they can trade, and when interest normally is paid. So it's obvious that's a sensible swap by the banking sector to go from having reserves to having bonds. And that again says that the government is not borrowing here, it's changing the form of the asset that banks the money they've already created from reserves to bonds. Now, why might they do that? We'll get onto that in a moment when I get slightly further on. Now they kind of interest on the bonds. Well, that is going to be over here. I'm going to put that interest on bonds to the banks. And where do I put the matching entries? Over here. So the interest being paid on bonds also creates money. And this is one thing which, again, you have to see the double entry bookkeeping to understand it. Once you do, it's obvious. When the government pays interest on bonds, that creates money as well as being financing the activities of the banking sector. And in a sense, you can see the way that I think about the role of reserves or this sort of lending now is that if the government simply created a deficit and then didn't convert the assets backing it from reserve to bonds, then banks would be carrying the entire cost of running the branch system that they have, the monetary exchange system we all use, for no reward. Whereas if they get the right to convert the money from reserves to bonds, then they get interest on bonds, and that effectively is paying them for running the private financial system we all use. So that's the basic logic, and that's really about all we need to understand the financial system. But to make a basic model, I've got to add a few more interrelations here. I'm just going to admit all the people. Somebody's called You're Not Showing Minsky. Intriguing name. Okay. So now, but if I want to tie this up, I have to have some other operation here. So the banks sell bonds to the public as well, and mainly this is to the non-bank financial sector. Again, if I was being more elaborate, I'd include another column here for the non-bank financial sector. But that means that to buy the bonds, the amount of money held in bonds, because the bonds are being sold by the banks to the public. And to do that, you've got to have a fall here in the deposits of the banking sector, or the deposit of the private sector in the banking system. So in that sense, bond sales by the private banks or by the Treasury, if they do it directly, to the public reduces the money supply. So they're getting quite a bit of clarification on what actually goes on just by filling out these tables. You don't need to build a model to understand what's taking place. And let's see. Okay, if you can watch on the people joining the waiting room, and that'd be very helpful. Now, having done that, you now have to pay interest. So interest to the public. And that is now going to be money that turns up in this account. So the interest on bonds to the public. And again, that is going to be over here. It's going to be creating additional reserves. So Minsky is making sure that all these elements are correct. And that's otherwise this some row won't sum to zero and you know you've made a mistake. Now, the final thing I want to have is the banks spending on the public. So I haven't got the banks actually spending the money there. So banks spend, whatever that might be, paying wages or buying goods or something of that nature. So I'm going to have minus bank. Actually, I'll have a minus spend underscore B here. So spending by the banking sector, and it's going to be spending that on the non-bank financial
Steve,
sector.
are you showing us some slides or not?
Oh, I've stopped showing the slides. I'm actually, can you see my screen properly or not?
I can see a blank screen. There's no slides.
Oh no, hang on. I can see what it's okay. It was the window alone. I was talking and I was thinking it was coming up on screen. And unfortunately, this Zoom was capturing the window, not the. Thank you for interrupting me there. It's not letting me choose the entire screen, unfortunately. So I'll have to. Oh, what a pain. Advanced. Okay. It looks. Oh, sorry about that. I was chatting away, thinking you could see what I was doing here, but in fact, you weren't seeing. I'll share the screen now. I've talked myself silly.
Okay. That's
without
better.
showing you that.
We can see that.
Okay. Right. My apologies. I thought it was actually being captured by Zoom, but it wasn't. Let's see if I can actually make that larger. Can I? Yes. Okay. So it looks like that region is being. Yeah, it's following that window around. I'll try something else quickly if I can. I'll just actually stop screen. Sorry about that. I'm very sorry it didn't happen. I'll just stop that share for a moment and I'll go back and try it again. But I'll use the whole of the Minsky canvas instead to share. Let's see if this works properly. So I'll share that. So you should be seeing a large blank just with the bank icon on it, nothing other than that. Is that correct? Seeing that? Are you now seeing a little table inside there as well?
No, just seeing kind of a bank symbol.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, I've got to. Obviously, Zoom is more limited than I thought it was, so I've got to choose what I actually show. I can do a workaround for that, but I'll go back and share just that window. Pardon me. Oh dear. Live and learn. Okay. So that's the table I've now built up so far. So you have bank lending. Okay. Creating, so there's reserves, loans, and bonds owned by the banking sector. Deposits, I've added savers there for the sheer heck of it to illustrate what neoclassicals think. What they think is this, so I'll put it back in again. They think that you have credit dollars per year paying out of one bank account and going into another, and there's no money being created. In the real world, what actually happens is that there's credit dollars created in the depositors, in the borrower's account, and credit loans created in the bank's asset account. So that's the basic logic there. Then you have the deficit. The government spends and puts the deficit dollars per year into the deposits of the private sector, and reserves go up by deficit dollars per year. That again is money creation. Okay. Now, when you then have interest being paid on loans, you've got credit being paid per year. You've got loans, dollars outstanding, interest is paid on the loans, there's your interest transaction. When the government sells bonds to the banking sector, they're offering bonds bonds sold by the Treasury to the banks. And that money, if the bond sales are equal to the deficit, then there is your, you effectively convert the reserves that are created by the deficit into bonds. And the reason the banks like that is they get paid interest. Okay. And they can also trade bonds where they can't trade in reserves and they don't get interest out of them. They can lend reserve, they can't trade them. So this is a major bonus for the banks to get bonds rather than having just reserves. And the interest on those bonds effectively finances the banks for running the banking sector as a public service to the rest of the community. Then you have interest being paid on bonds. That again creates money because you have the short-term equity of the banking sector rising, and at the same time you have the reserves, the banking sector rising. So paying interest on treasury bonds creates money. When the banking sector sells bonds to non-banks, it normally sells to non-bank financial institutions rather than to private individuals. That reduces the money supply. The bonds are taken out of the assets of the banking sector. They're put into the liability. That reduces the liability of the banking sector. So that's why they sell the bonds. The interest of the public also creates money. Reserves rise and money inside the deposit accounts of the private sector rise. And then I have spending by the banks on the rest of the economy. And that's pretty much your basic logic of a banking system, except I've left out one thing. So I'll just actually insert one more row here, and that's the central bank buys bonds. So what happens in that case? Well, you now have the amount of money here going down. This is bond sales by the banks to the central bank. And now I'm using the curly brackets feature of Minsky that will superscript what comes after the curly bracket onto the last curly bracket. And that means that therefore what's going to happen is that their reserves again go up. Now, so in this case, you can see straight away that central bank purchases of treasury bonds do not create money. Because again, is a mistake that I've seen some more progressive people make as well as mainstreamers. And I used to think this myself, okay, quite seriously. I thought that was necessary to monetize the deficit. In fact, it's not, okay? To create money, you must have an operation that occurs both on the asset side and the liability / short-term equity side of the banking sector. Now, any operation that doesn't occur on both won't create money. It either shuffles liabilities around as interest on loans do, or it shuffles assets around as buying bonds from reserves and then buying the bonds back from the central bank do. So the only operations that are creating money here are ones with a single entry on the deposit and liability side and a single entry on the asset side, and that's the deficit itself, credit, which creates money, and interest payments by the bank, by the government on treasury bonds. So that's your basic logic. So if the government doesn't borrow to create money, why does it issue bonds in the first place? Partly, as I've said, it's because that actually finances the banks for what they're doing. But there's another reason, and to show that, I'm going to have to go to another godly table, which means I've got to go through a bit of a rigmarole here and go back, and I'll create the, I'll now share the Minsky itself and share that. And now to get around that hassle last time, I'm going to go to what we call editor mode in Minsky. And if I drag this out, you're going to see what I've just created in terms of the godly table on the screen there. And I'm going to push my luck. And I'll just quickly label this as the banking sector. So I've got a little window that's come up that you can't see. Well, I'm just calling this the banks. And that's now the label there. And now I'm going to create another table and see what's happening at the central, at the federal, I'll call it the Fed. It's the central bank. This is the central bank. There's the Fed. So now I'm going to go to editor mode for it as well. And we're enabling this. I'm not sure how well it's going to work. And it doesn't. So I've got to bring up another table. So I'm going to, yet again, stop the share. I'll actually bring up the God. So just tell me, can you see another little window there on screen? You can't see it, I take it. You want to see those two forms, not a third. I'm presuming that's the case. I'm going to stop the share here for a moment and then go back and share that little window. That's the godly table for the Fed. So now what I've done, I've created a whole set of assets and liabilities for the banking system. These little drop downs here say, well, find me, if I click on the one asset, it says, find me a liability that hasn't yet been shown in an asset. I click on that and I get deposits and savers, neither of which are relevant for what we're doing here. If I click on the liability, I get bonds owned by the banks, and that's a liability to Treasury. I get loans, which are a liability of the private sector, but I want reserves. So I click on reserves, and Minsky instantly populates that table. So as you can see, I've now got all the operations that I've recorded on the asset side of the banking sector now turning up on the liability side here. I'll just actually now going to create extra columns here. So I'll make this the Fed's equity. So there are reserves. We've got this central bank buying bonds. So I'll say bonds owned by the central bank. And I've now got these various operations taking place. Well, where do they take place from? Well, we are going to have the Treasury's deposit account. I'll call Treasury _D here for the sake of, I could have used deposit. I could have used the same for the public, but I'll just call it Treasury D there. So the Treasury has some money, in the deposit account that has at the central bank, and that is backed by bonds that the central bank has already purchased. And I've got to make that sum to the same as the whole row. So I've now got that the first row in terms of the initial conditions is now correct. Now the CB buys bonds. Well, I've got the reserves going up, which are a liability. That turns up as an asset for the central bank. And what have I done? Oh, that's correct. Okay. So that when the central bank buys bonds, it creates its own reserves, assets, and it creates its own liability as well. So that's creating money, not in the circuit that we work in. This is creating it in the circuit that manages the interaction between the private banks themselves and the central bank, and also the Treasury. Now, I've got Treasury bond sales going on here. Where did the money from the sales go to? Well, it goes to the Treasury. So if I now show that, pardon me, we'll type the Y by accident there. So the bonds increase the amount of money in the Treasury's account at the central bank. Now the deficit reduces that money, and interest payments reduce that money. So I now just show these here. I've got the interest on bonds paid to the banks and interest on bonds paid to the public. So there's your basic logic that I've now covered the Fed in the overall operation. And I'll just have to go back and show this on the screen once more. So I'm getting to the point where I'm able to define what are the overall interrelations in this basic economy. So stop sharing. Now what I want to do is add another godly table. So I'll go and add that. I'm just doing this in the background because I know it won't work if I try to show it properly. So I've created another table, which I'm going to label this one Treasury. And I'll now bring up its godly table and make it a bit larger. And now I'll share it. Oh, I am doing a screen share. Okay. Okay, so stop the share. Now I'll go back and share again. This is the first time I'm finding Zoom more of a pain than using some Windows applications, Microsoft applications. So now I'm looking at the Treasury's point of view. And what are the assets and liabilities the Treasury has? Well, one of its assets is bank account at the central bank. So I click here, and now I've got all the operations on the asset side for the Treasury. What are its liabilities? Well, it has bonds that are owned by the banking sector, and it also has bonds that are owned by the central bank. It doesn't have the loans, of course. I haven't got the private sector's finances in there so far. So the deficit. Where do I take the deficit off? It doesn't affect the bonds. It actually affects the equity. I'll actually type Treasury equity up here. This is the equity of the Treasury. So notice the sum of these other rows is now minus 600. So I've got to show the Treasury is in negative equity. And this is the standard situation for a fiat currency issuer. They are in negative equity. This is what people don't understand about how a fiat money system works. So the deficit, in terms of flows over time, the deficit reduces the equity of the Treasury. So does paying interest on bonds to the banks and paying interest on bonds to the public. And bond sales, when the bank sells bonds to the public, that, hang on, I think I've got that one covered quite, that I've got to cover separately because I haven't actually got the public, but I'll add that here because we now have another liability, which we haven't yet shown created properly, but bonds owned by the public. So when I now show this operation, I have to show that liability rising when the government, when the private banks sell bonds to the public. That increases the liability of the banking sector to the Treasury to the public. So there's my overall pattern for the Treasury. Again, I'll have to stop sharing here. Okay, and then go back, and I'll now add one more godly table, which is going to be the public. And given the screen size, I might actually go horizontal here. So I'm going to call this public. and put that in editor mode as well, so we can see it later once I put it all together. Bring up its godly table, and now I'm going to share that godly table. So I build the public's view. So share screen and godly table for the public. Okay. I'll make that, move it a bit larger. So now I'll just make the, what are the assets that haven't been allocated yet as a liability? Well, deposits are an asset of the banking sector. I've got savers there as well. I might as well whack that in for the heck of it. I'm going to actually use it in this demonstration. And I've also got bonds that are owned by the public. Well, let's bring that inside there. And now I've got most of their asset transactions. So what about the liability? Well, they borrowed money from the bank. So there are the loans. And now finally, I've got the public equity. And now let's complete this whole thing. So the public has deposits of 1,300. I'll make the bonds owned by the public say 100. And I've got to cover that in another table. I've got to go back and fix it up in a moment. So the public starts with an equity of 400 in this model. And now I show what happens. What does the deficit do? Well, again, the only place you can put the deficit is increasing the equity of the private sector. So the deficit increases the equity of the public non-bank sector. Interest on bonds also increases their equity. Paying interest on loans reduces their equity, but it transfers it across to the banking sector, and spending by the banking sector on the public increases the equity of the private sector. So there's your basic logic, and I'll now go back and demonstrate that on the overall screen. Just shut that window down. Hang on, I'll stop screen sharing. And now let's just take a look at those four. Once I've got the layout fixed up a bit, we can see the overall logic here. Okay, I'll go back and share now. All right. So can you see that overall window?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and that window moved. I'm just checking I've got the right one. That window moved? Okay. So
yes,
I've got to fix, good, okay. I've got to fix up one more thing. I've got the Treasury's equity wrong because I've changed the valuation of bonds. I'll just go across and do that in a separate window. You won't see as I do it. But I'm now going to say the Treasury's equity is actually minus 700, not minus 600. So let's just do that. And I'll just save that. Now, if I recalculate everything, we can take a look at the overall logic here, and I'll make this all full screen. So what you can see, I've got all the assets minus liability minus equity checks are correct. So we know the accounting is correct here. And therefore you're looking at an accurate model, simulation model, obviously, and simplified, but an accurate model of the fundamental operations of the monetary economy. And if we now take a look at the equity situation, the Fed's equity is unaffected. I've got it showing at 0 here. I could make it positive by putting a large number over here, but the Fed doesn't need equity. And this again is something I didn't understand until I built models using Minsky's powers here. I thought the Fed would end up in negative equity. In fact, the part of the government ends up in negative equity is the Treasury over here, because you can see I've got the deficit and the interest payments both taking money out of the Treasury's equity. So the Treasury is running at a negative equity. Who's getting the positive equity out of that? It's the public and the banking sector. So here I've got interest on bonds paid to the banking sector. That's increasing the equity of the banking sector, of the private banking sector. Then I have interest on bonds paid to the public plus the deficit, and that's increasing the equity of the non-bank public. So the negative equity of the Treasury creates identical positive equity for the private sector. And if the government actually ran enough surpluses to put itself into surplus, it would be in positive equity and the public would be in negative equity. So the objective that people are trying to work towards of the government running a surplus, which they think is about saving money for the public's benefit, would actually mean the public was in debt to the government, which is not what people think about they're doing at all. This is why it's so important to understand the double and triple bookkeeping. So there's our overall situation. I'll just go back and put this back to the normal scale now. So that's our starting point. And if you understand that alone, and you can elaborate by adding other opponents to the economy and so on, you've got a basic understanding of the monetary system that exceeds that of anybody with a PhD in economics who believes neoclassical theory. Okay, it's just that simple. Now, what I'm going to do as well, and I'm not sure that it'll turn up here, is I'm going to bring up our browser, and I'm not sure, you probably can't see this because it's going to be a separate window. So I take it you can't see another window there, correct? Okay, I'll just actually, I'll use it to show what I'm going to do, because what I've got now is a little window that you presume is not showing to you, which has got all the variables that have been created in the model so far. And the simplest one to define is interest on loans. So I'm going to bring interest on loans onto the canvas here and zoom in so you can see it. There's interest on loans. And if I go back to the browser, I want to bring over loans as well. So I'll bring over loans and place loans here. And now if I zoom down, I can actually show you those two. And so what I want us to start doing is defining the flows involved in the model. And the obvious thing about what is interest? It's the rate of interest on loans multiplied by loans. So I just created a variable called RL. I have no idea what's got 22 there. I might just see if I can change that name. I must have pressed a key at the time. Make that a parameter and say it's 5%. And give it I'll call this interest on loans, or interest on private debt. And let's say I've got a maximum value of 20%, a minimum of 2%, and a step size of 1%. If I want to just illustrate it. Then now what I've got is, I can put this anywhere I like, I'll just drag it up there. And if I press the multiply key, I get, or this asterisk, then I can just drag from the output ports of RL and loans to the input ports of multiply, and the output port of multiply to the input port of interest on loans. And if I hit the recalculate key, it'll tell me that that currently is running at $50 or $1 billion per year, with the debt levels 1,000. So that's how you define an equation in Minsky. And I'm going to keep on going and see if I can put together a full model. Now, Nadeem, you'll need to shut me up if I start talking for too long. I won't necessarily get a chance to put a full model together, but I've got one sitting that I can come and show when necessary. So let's just go, I'll just go back to the standard scale of the program again. And I now want to include turnover, effectively the GDP. And again, for a simple model like this, the trick that I use is to say that I just basically borrowed from Milton Friedman. And I say that deposits times the velocity of money is equal to the GDP. So I'm going to type V underscore M here, velocity of money. Make that you can't see the window I'm doing it on, unfortunately, but I'm making it into a parameter, giving it a value of, say, 2 initially, and a range of between 4 and 0.5, because it's actually getting to that level, and a step size of 1. And now what I've got is I can multiply the velocity of money by, not deposits. I've got to include one more element that I forgot to include, but I'll show you that in a, actually I better bring that in as well. I haven't got the bank equity there, and bank equity, short-term equity, is part of the money supply. So let's bring over bank equity using the browser to get it. So I have deposit plus bank equity, press the plus key, and I can now add those two together. I can now define this to be money. Misspelt money, so let's go and change that first character to an M. And then drag from the output of the plus to the input. There's my money supply. And I'll just move these around a bit. So velocity of money times money is equal to GDP. Of course, I can be much more elaborate and have a physical monetary system and prices, et cetera, et cetera. But this is just to make those basic points about the monetary system. So I hit recalculate, and it'll tell me with deposits, my current GDP is 3,200, that's 3,200 billion. Maybe the economy of Pakistan, I'm not sure in terms of US dollars, but that sort of thing. So I can now rearrange things. I can just grab and slice and drag a whole unit there. So I've got GDP, I've got money supply, and the simplest way to bring in the deficit is to have say a deficit. And I know it's not this simple in the real world, just again in the model, deficit as a percent of GDP. So I'll just actually use this little definition. And again, this is using the superscript and subscript capabilities of Minsky. But there's the deficit of a percentage of GDP. And what I'm going to do is just make that into a parameter. I forgot to change its type. Doesn't really matter. It'll work as a flow, but it's just easier to see what's going on. You know, which are the constants you've assumed in a model and what are actually being set by feedbacks in the model itself. So the deficit of percentage of GDP multiplied by GDP is going to be equal to the deficit. So I'll just actually drag this over here to find that. Now I need to bring across the variable deficit, and again that's listed on the browser window you can't see. So now I've defined the deficit. Now at the moment it's 0, but let's say I make this, I haven't actually set the step size. I think I forgot to do that. Yeah, so just say the deficit starts at say 0, but it has a minimum of, hang on. So a deficit starting at 0% of GDP has a maximum of say 20% because it has been that high, and a minimum of, I think that's a surplus. No, the deficit, that does make sense. The surplus has been as large as say 0.05%, and let's say a step size of 1% of GDP. Having done all that, now I can, if I press the up arrow key, I change the number. You can see the number changing there. So I can actually do this live during a simulation to see what the impact is. Sometimes rounding errors will get in the way. That is actually 0, but it's being shown as a crazy level of accuracy there. Is anybody from the chat there? Okay, hands, vote hands, good one. So there's defining a basic starting point to defining a monetary model. And I'll just now add credit as a percentage of GDP as well too. So if I go to my browser window, which again, I wish you could see, but it's not possible with Zoom, there's credit, and I can do the same thing. I can define credit as being a percentage of GDP. So it's going to be another multiply sign, and I can drag the stuff around any way I like. I don't have to define beforehand. That's going to be GDP, and I'll now have this being credit as a percent of GDP as well. And again, that's another parameter. And if I want to change the range, I'll start that again at 0. Give a maximum of say 40% of GDP. It's been about that high in some countries. Minus 20%. It's also hit during periods like the Great Depression and so on. And so I now multiply credit by GDP, and I'll just actually slide that, I'll do that in a moment, slide this over here a bit. So just showing a few of the features of Minsky. You can use objects anywhere you like on the screen, just by creating them, putting them on the screen somewhere, and you can have 2 or more outputs from one input, and you can have multiple inputs into one input. Well, I've got banks and savers and deposit that are creating the money supply, but I haven't actually used savers, but I know I've got it there. So if I just click on savers and bring it over, then I can add that in here, and I can overload operations like a plus, which is actually very difficult to do in any other system dynamics program. They will require to add extra input blocks. We just say, well, let's make it a multi-user input. Now, having done all that, I've got, in fact, a model that I think I can actually simulate. I'll hit the run key here. You won't see anything on screen particularly. But if I now, oh, you can see a bit happening down there. So I'll now bring a plot in, and let's plot GDP. So I'll take a copy of GDP and paste it over here. And then I'll make this graph a bit larger. Choose options so I can label it. So this is GDP and the year of it happening, and this is in dollars. Okay. And now if I simulate the model, I've got a constant GDP because there's no change in the money supply. But what happens if the government runs a deficit? Let's actually have it running a 1% of GDP deficit. You're creating money. and that's adding to economic activity. Equally, credit will do the same thing. Have credit being part of the system, and you're creating additional money there as well. So they're both creating money, and they both turn up as money that turns over in demand. Now, what if you're in a surplus? Go the opposite direction, go for negative. Is the government trying to control its deficit, and the GDP is still rising because of the credit money? There, I'll go back to zero there. If you just run a surplus, you're going to reduce the economy. Okay, that's just running a large surplus. So that's a mistake. Let's go in the opposite direction. So this is illustrating very simply the deficit actually expands economic activity. It doesn't reduce it, it expands it. And this, again, the whole mainstream way of thinking about this is completely wrong. Now, what we see during the 1920s is that Calvin Coolidge thought that his surplus was causing the economy to grow. So I can actually model that because he was running a surplus of 1% of GDP. What he did on its own, you'd actually have a falling level of economic activity. But at the same time, the private sector was borrowing about 5% of GDP. And that's where the boom came from. That's getting, you're seeing the absolute level there, which is why it gets to be so extreme. Well, I can actually do a bit of extra work and let's look at the growth rate. I take a copy of GDP, and now I'll feed this into a differential block. So I get the rate of change of GDP. I'll zoom in so you can see that more easily. And then I divide the rate of change by the level. That is now a fractional rate of change. I can bring in a percentage block from the constants up here and feed that through here, and I've now got growth rate. So I'll call this G underscore R for growth rate. And now I can graph the growth rate. So I'll put a separate graph in for there. Just moving the screen by holding the shift key down and dragging up. I now have another chart that I'll put down here. I'll make it the same scale as this one. And now this is now going to be labeled the growth rate. And this is in percent per year, pardon me. And now we see what happens when we make all those machinations with the deficit and the surplus again. So let's go back to normal scale view. I'll make these a bit smaller because I'm mainly, now that I've done that, I can focus on the flowchart dynamics I'm adding as well as making these windows a bit smaller. So I can move things around. I'm waiting for that change of color to occur. That's when you can actually grab one of the edges of the Godley table. It's fairly pixel sharp, so you can see I'm getting it and missing it sometimes. So I'll make a bit more space here, let up a bit there. And now if I zoom, we'll see a bit more of the content there. So now I can do the same exercise. Let's go back to zero again, reset the model, go back to stop. Start at the end, but I'll run it more slowly. I'm going to start with no deficit, no credit. And what you get is a constant level of GDP. Then you have the private sector borrowing money, so you get a jump on the growth rate. The growth rate is now 40, which is 40%. That's a bit on the high side. But I'll bring a bit. Well, it shouldn't be that high. Okay, probably because the starting point was lower. Okay, let's bring it down a bit. But also, in that situation of a boom going on, you have the government running a surplus. And that works. You can have a growing economy. Notice the growth rate dropped a bit. If I have no deficit and the government runs a surplus, the growth rate drops, and more of it for a larger drop. But so long as the private sector is still borrowing money, you can have the government running a huge surplus and the economy is still growing. And the government can actually think that its surplus is causing the growth. What's actually causing the growth is credit. If credit disappears, you're in deep doo-doo. And the only way out of it is for the government to go into deficit spending, which takes it a while to understand. So that, I think, will do. I might actually do this in 2 stages, but what I've shown over the monetary dynamic, what I can do later is talk a bit about the dynamics of debt deflation and so on. So I'll leave it there and see if there are any questions to answer.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Let me begin by, let me ask everybody to raise their hands and come into the discussion as they see fit. But let me begin by asking you, we still reach the same conclusion that if the government expands, there will be growth. And if the government contracts, there will be a recession, so to speak.
In monetary, in monetary terms as well. Yeah, in simple terms, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, let me take it in another direction. If we think of it in terms of a fund program or in terms of disinflation, as the world is going towards disinflation, the conclusion still stands that the Fed should raise interest rates and contract the economy to have a disinflation program. You reach the same conclusion?
Not the same conclusion, because what they look at is they simply think they're adjusting the attractiveness of investment and the attractiveness of consumption. That's their vision. They don't think there's anything, they're not doing anything about credit demand, because according to them, there is no such thing as credit demand for a part of aggregate demand, because credit is a transfer from one individual to another. So the credit doesn't turn up in their aggregate thinking. That's the biggest mistake they make, because if you, and I can show some data on this front too, and I get a few minutes to put things together. That's what caused the financial crisis. Credit in America went from plus 15% of GDP in 2006 to minus 5% in 2009, and that's what caused the downturn. Now they don't think it plays any role at all. They leave it out of their thinking.
Okay, let me bring in a question from the floor. Regan Boychuk.
Need to unmute Regan. Hang on.
Yeah.
Let's see. Can I?
Go ahead.
Regan, do you want to ask a question or make a comment? Doesn't seem to.
Sorry.
Oh, here we go. Good.
No, sorry.
Yeah, Regan.
I don't have a question. Sorry.
Oh, okay, right.
Okay. No
What about Shahid? Shahid.
I must have missed the hand. Okay, Shahid.
Yeah, hi, Steve. Thank you for the presentation. Although I'd be honest with you, it's not easy to understand this in one go.
No, that's true.
It's something new for me, and I understand. I've read what you said about Bank of England and Bundesbank saying about money creation. I agree with that, but still, the way you were modeling it and trying to insert everything and show this in context of GDP growth and everything, that would take some time. That would take some catch up and time. But anyway, I do have a few questions. One is, how does your model, or how do your conclusions feed into expectations? Now, expectations are a large part of the monetary policies. And
no, they're not. No, they're a large part of the neoclassical model of monetary policy. They're not part of the real world in any shape or form. Neoclassicals convinced themselves ages ago that what causes inflation is expectations of inflation. This is Milton Friedman's contribution back on the optimal quantity of money. And he argued that you have a system in general equilibrium, supply equal demand in all markets, and rising prices because people expect rising prices. And the rising prices are being caused by an increase in the money supply. So that's the whole idea of the helicopter thing. So expectations are important, but they're nothing like what neoclassicals think they are, and they are not the main way in which the monetary system is controlled.
All right. Now that's something, honestly, as you said, that's something not just new, but also a pretty what you'd say, unclassical, if I can put it in the right way, unclassical and nothing and not ordinary but extraordinary something. That's why I'm saying that it might take some time to understand this. And one other question, in your model, the way you're describing it, how does it change if you or what kind of behavioral change do you expect when we switch from the traditional neoclassical model to what you are describing. Now, what I am saying is that's in context of the fact that in Pakistan, almost 70% of the credit stock is held by the government and its institutions. And almost 70% of the flow is also 65 to 70% of the credit flow is also goes to the government. So what distinguishes your model from the new classical in terms of behavior of how government goes about it? I mean, does it does it does it I can't remember the right word, but does it out sorry, but the private sector, it can't if they can't reach the desired credit level, if they can't get the desired credit that they do, I can't remember. So how does your model differ from the NICLA? What does your model predict that in terms of government behavior and inflation? Sorry.
Well, in inflation, the neoclassical version, if you can imagine the money system is like a floor and it goes up and it pushes prices up. That's the way neoclassicals think. The reality of the monetary system is a ceiling, and if prices are pushing up, it'll push up the money supply, because what's going on, this particularly applied very much in the 70s, not so much now, that corporations worked on lines of credit, which are a bit like your credit card, only much, much larger. Rather than having a limit of $1,000, they have a limit of $1 trillion, of $1 billion or $10 billion. So they'd have headroom there that meant they could access that money at any time they liked. So they faced a higher charge for paying wages or a higher charge for paying oil prices. They paid these using their lines of credit, which expanded the money supply. So rising prices cause rising money supply. Okay, the inverse of what neoclassicals argue. So the money supply tends to be, as I said, it's a roof which the real economy pushes up. It's not a floor that pushes up the real economy.
Right, Steve. Wow. As I said, it's something completely out of the ordinary. It's something besides the ordinary. So yeah, it will take some time to catch up. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Okay, and put your hand down if you can. And Nassim.
Nassim Beg. Nassim Beg's up. He can't hear us, I think. Mavish Mahmood.
Yeah, you've muted yourself again. Nassim, unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Keen, for this very insightful discussion. I'm not an economist, but I've just recently... can you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mavish, go ahead.
Yeah, I just recently was reading up on stagflation. So my question is that, does your model take into account stagflation? And if it does, how does it counter it, and what is the way forward?
Yeah.
What
I've shown you is a modeling framework, not a model. So as such, I mean, I'm modeling a bit to have GDP, and I'm assuming that GDP is the turnover of money and things like that. But it's mainly a very illustrative model to show what the actual financial dynamics are. Then I'll put a very simple extension to enable me to look at the claims about what will happen if you run a surplus versus a deficit. That's very, very simple. When you get to a much more complicated thing like trying to model the actual real world, then what I see is what has stagflation came from. If you go back to the 1970s, when we had that experience, the 70s and early 80s, what you had was the extremely large credit bubble, which burst in 1973, 74. And that was a global thing. And that credit bubble was financing a large amount of investment. And because you had a booming economy at the same time, you had high wage rises. And then you had the Yom Kippur War, where when the Arabs lost the Yom Kippur War, they blockaded oil to any country that supported Israel, which of course included America. So oil prices went from $2.50 a barrel to 10. Now, what that meant was you had rising cost of raw materials cutting into capitalist profits. You had rising wages cutting into capitalist profits. And in that situation, the profits capitalists were making at the top of the boom was far less than they were expecting. So you got a sudden collapse in their willingness to invest. And you had and less corporate borrowing as well. So you had a decline in credit-based demand, and you had falling output. But you also had this momentum from the wage rises and the oil price rises. And that momentum continued on for some time. So that's your real cause of stagflation. This is the explanation that Minsky gave, Hyman Minsky, and it's one that I find compelling, and I can actually model it when I have a more general model. But because there are time lags involved in the system, workers are still demanding and being able to achieve wage rises, even when the rate of unemployment is starting to fall, starting to rise. And that's what you had. That's the carryover period that gave us stagflation. And the reason the neoclassicals are very good at caricaturing anybody else's argument. They're not very good at understanding somebody else's argument. So they criticized Phillips and said Phillips got it all wrong. Phillips actually had every last element that the neoclassicals put into their thinking in his model back in 1957, because he said that what determines rises not just in wages, but he called factor prices, but I'll stick with wages in this case, was first of all, a low level of unemployment, meaning high wage rises, but also the rate of change of unemployment turning up. So if you had high unemployment, but the rate of change was negative, so unemployment was falling, that would give you capacity for more wage rises. Then if you had low unemployment, but rising, then that would cause falling wage rises. And then finally, he included what he called cost of living adjustments. Oh, and he actually talked about a wage price spiral too. But he saw the cost of living coming from the impact of foreign prices on domestic activity. So he had all three factors that the neoclassical think they're really hot shit about having in their own models these days. He had it back in 56. So the stagflationary exercise is a period where those more complicated dynamics turn up in a way you can't show with just if you cut it down to just one causal factor, which is the unemployment rate, you can't get as much as that overlap of stagflation period that we saw. But if you include workers responding to change in the level of the rate, change in the level of unemployment, then you can get that overlap as well. So we didn't need neoclassicals to explain it. In fact, they stuffed things up.
Naseem Beg, sir.
Thank you. Steve, my quick question. There is the credit system outside the banking system, which is the futures market. A lot of leverage trading takes place. And at times we see a quick run up of prices and then a collapse, but it tends to impact the entire economy. Other than just the participants in the marketplace, there should be some people taking a bath or lose their shirts, but the entire economy gets impacted. Now, I would imagine it's because while the asset prices have shot up in that short-term credit created in the futures market, it then seeps through into the economy and banks lend more money. And then when it collapses, banks want the money back and causes shrinkage of money supply. Am I kind of right in that? Because there's not enough data available on how, or research available on how this collapse of leverage markets seeps through into the economy.
Well, what you actually find is the data certainly exists, the level of margin debt rises. So a lot of shares are bought using debt. And the mainstream says we can ignore that because of the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis that a lowly levered person can buy a highly levered company, or a highly levered person can buy a lowly levered company. Therefore, the level of debt doesn't matter. That's nonsense. When you do the empirical research, you find an extremely strong correlation between change in the change of the level of margin debt and change in asset prices. So it's all driven, again, there's extra money demand coming in. So when the margin debt is rising, you've got credit being created, but for the financial sector. And then when it's falling, you've got negative credit. And that feeds over into the real world as well, because what you're putting a valuation on, and I have included this in these models, is non-financial assets, because the financial asset is your claim on somebody else. So if I lent money to Nadeem, I'd have a financial claim on him. He'd have a financial liability to me. That's the financial. They necessarily sum to zero. But if I value my flat in Amsterdam, I'm putting a monetary valuation on a non-liquid asset, and that is actually driven by the amount of money I'm willing to borrow to buy or sell that property. So leverage on financial asset, on non-financial assets, driven by the financial sector, and that's why it will come crashing down, because when those prices fall, particularly if we're talking share prices, where they feed right into the equity situation of non-bank financial intermediaries. So what do you call the vampire squid, the Morgan Stanley and Chase Manhattan and all those non-bank financial institutions, they have on their asset side, they have a large amount of the share portfolio. And what can actually cause chaos, and it did back in the 2008 financial crisis, is that if they go bankrupt, that's the end of any activity they do facilitate. Now, the reason that the Bear Stearns collapse was so deadly, and it wasn't expected by the authorities, the authorities didn't realize that Bear Stearns had monopolized the commercial paper market. And the commercial paper market is pretty much a replacement for the days of lines of credit from banks, where rather than accessing a line of credit to pay its wages, a corporation now issues short-term, like very short-term, 30-day type bonds, and get them converted into money and then pay a small amount more money back when they redeem the bond. And that trading occurred through Bear Stearns. Now, when Bear Stearns went bankrupt, that ended that whole trade, and that meant you weren't paying wages the next day or the next week. So that's why there was such a drastic impact of the financial sector on the rest of the economy. Valuation of non-financial assets and ending transactions that are a vital part of the real economy.
Yeah. So just as a follow-up on that, the leverage markets, whoever manages those, take margins, but they're looking at avoiding failed settlements, while the central banks seem to think it's not their area of activity, so they don't get involved. Albeit post 1929, I think it was in 1935 that the Congress legislated and allowed the Feds to set the margin requirements for the equity leveraging. But I don't think the central bankers have ever kind of really carried this through to figure out that it's actually ultimately causing money creation and then a collapse in money supply and then havoc in the economies.
Yeah, well, this is one of the remarkable things about how little attention we're paid to private debt. And I might, when we finish these questions, I'll go and I'll build a model, a feedback model, which is my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and I'll build that live in Minsky as well. But when I took a look at the data for margin debt, the maximum amount that margin debt has been as a percentage of GDP in our lifetimes, I think is about 3.5% of GDP, maybe 3%, and that was during the 2000 bubble. When I got data on margin debt in the 1920s, it turned that margin debt had gone from less than 1% of GDP in the beginning of the 1920s to 13% of GDP in the peak of the bubble in 1929. And then it fell to zero, pretty much. And people are borrowing on margin with a 10% deposit. So you put down $100,000, you buy $1 million worth of shares. If the shares increase by 10%, you turn your 100,000 into 200,000. But if the shares fall by 10%, you're bankrupt. Now, of course, they fell by 10% in one day in 1929. And that was why that crisis was so existential, that it literally wiped people out, because with margin debt, the firm has a complete recourse to your assets. So if you've got a Rolls Royce and you're 10,000 short, you've got to sell the Rolls Royce or you go to jail. And that's why margin debt was so deadly back in the 1920s. Now, the rule change was made after that to limit margin debt to 50%. So if you want to buy $1 million worth of shares, you've got to put down $500,000 worth. But we've still got this 2-for-1 leverage turning up there. And I'm sure a large amount of the buying done by non-bank financial institutions is involving loans from banks and so on. So it's more levered than we realize. So that's one reason why the asset market, the share market in particular, feeds back with such viciousness on the real economy.
Okay, thank you very much.
Neo? Neo?
Yes. So can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So Professor Keen, I've heard it often be said that things like MMT are sort of irrelevant for developing countries that lack meaningful monetary sovereignty. So what are your thoughts on this? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I differ. MMT argues that exports and what's one of the fancy lines? Exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. That's another part. That's one of Warren Mosler's sayings, which MMT, in my opinion, hasn't had the balls to criticize. I think it's completely wrong. There's a whole range of reasons as to why it's wrong. But when you look at it in a monetary sense, if you're running a trade surplus, then you are insulated from overseas effects in the sense that you're not having to borrow other people's money. You can actually convert your own surplus if you need to into foreign currency, and you're safe. If you're running a deficit and you're a developing country, then you might have to borrow in another currency, borrow an American dollar to be able to buy American goods, and that's the real danger. So a country running a trade surplus is insulated from that dilemma. And you look at places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, et cetera, for a large part of their development, they're running trade surpluses. And that's one reason why they were insulated, and they didn't suffer the sort of effects you saw out of places like Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe, where they're running a huge trade deficit, and therefore they had to borrow money that wasn't their own. So it's extremely important, in my opinion, to limit the scale of trade surpluses and deficits. And this is what Keynes tried to do with the Bancor back in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Agreement. He wanted to have a system where there was an international currency, not a national currency elevated to be a global currency, but a currency created specifically for international trade, fixed exchange rates between national currencies and that Bancor. But if you ran a persistent surplus, or a persistent deficit rather, you'd be forced to devalue. A persistent surplus, you'd be forced to revalue. And his whole idea was to keep deficits and surpluses to of the order of no more than 2% of GDP. Instead, in the world we're actually in, we're seeing deficits and surpluses of 10% of GDP. Now, there's trade surpluses. Now, neoclassicals thought that would solve everything because we'd get a price adjustment, currencies would change, and we'd go back to zero. Well, I'm sorry, 10 is a long way from zero. And that has been persistent. Countries like Japan have maintained trade surpluses for decades, despite their currency being on a floating exchange rate. So you can't rely upon the price system to eliminate those imbalances. And I really wish we did have a system like the Bancor for international trade.
Steve, let me just then ask you.
Okay.
Looking forward, how do you see central banking changing if your framework is adopted?
Quite radically, because first of all, they'd realize that interest rates aren't the control mechanism they think they are. And what they're controlling is credit. They're not controlling intraday expectation. They're controlling the creation of credit. They'd also see their role as being limiting the amount of credit that can be created. We should not be allowing banks to create money for speculation, which is all they're really doing. For innovation, sure. For working capital, sure. For short-term consumption, sure, but not for speculation. So the central banks would be much, much more in control of the private banking sector, saying you can't lend for that purpose. So I would, for example, limit loans against assets to no more than 10 times the income earning potential of the asset. So rather than, like, if you imagine a company paying a dividend of 5%, which is the company pay dividend, that's not 5% on face value, is not too large, not too small. Then at most you could offer would be 50% of the purchase price of the share. You couldn't be buying the huge margin that do exist. I'd actually like to ban margin loans completely. I think they're a dangerous addition to volatility, with very notable addition to the creation of actual physical working capital. And in housing, I do the same thing. I have what I call the property income limited leverage, so that there would be a rule enforced by law courts that if you were buying a property, the price you could pay for it, the amount of money you could borrow to buy it would be no more than 10 times the annual rental income of the property. Now, that would, if we actually brought that rule in right now to some national housing markets, the Australian one for sure, probably the UK one as well, that'd halve house prices. Now, you can't do it all overnight, obviously. You have to be very careful about it, but it'd be prudential controls like that would become much more the part of the weaponry of central banks. Yeah, and you would, their main focus, which is the one they tend to ignore until all hell breaks loose, their main role is to ensure the reliability of the payment system. And that would be much more important, in my way of thinking, than what they're trying to do by using interest rates to control the system. And then they'd be aware that interest rates aren't the be all and end all. This fetish about interest rates is just wrong. A lot more would go back to what you do with fiscal policy and with bond sales. And I would see the central bank quite possibly selling bonds to the public to reduce, when they felt there was too much inflation happening, or if the money supply growing too quickly, then they'd be selling bonds to the public to reduce the money supply, those sorts of operations.
Mm-hmm. But let me ask you, isn't what the early form of central banking, modern central banking, was to control credit and to control monetary aggregates, and that eventually was given up in favor of other things, and eventually we've had many monetary framework changes to converge to what we might call interest rate management or inflation targeting. So in a sense, does macroeconomic keep reinventing the wheel? Sometimes we go to fixed exchanges, sometimes flexible exchanges, interest rates.
They still haven't realized the wheel. They don't realize that a wheel's supposed to be circular. I mean, I watch neoclassical economists, and I just think I'm face palming all the time with the mistakes they're making and how they think the economy operates. But it's such a self-contained system, it's such a strong belief system, they can't break out of it. So, for example, there's a new paper by Stern and Stiglitz criticizing integrated assessment models, the nonsense that people like Nordhaus and Toll create, trying to model climate change and doing an appallingly bad job of it. Even though they missed the empirical shit that those guys created, they criticize the models for all sorts of reasons. But there are solutions to think about how do we get the expected utility right, and how do we know we're increasing people's utility versus not really increasing people's utility, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a mind trap, and once they're in there, the link between the mind trap they're in and the real world can be quite tenuous.
See, in some sense, are you taking into account the technological improvements that are coming? For example, the cryptocurrency revolution that's happening, how will that challenge the modern monetary framework as well as your framework? And also the fact that technological revolution is increasing productivity, which we are hoping will come through. Then again, does that change the way we look at things or not?
Again, I look at that in a very cynical way, because what we call, for start, the cryptocurrencies, as it happens, Minsky is now being used by a group in the Czech Republic to build on contract, build models of cryptocurrencies, because so many cryptocurrencies created themselves with a sort of an Austrian idea of how the money system works or some other nonsensical idea, and we set them up for collapse. So this group in the Czech Republic will model the double and triple keeping implications of a suggested design of cryptocurrency, and they're doing it for a fee. So Minsky is actually being used to profit from the cryptocurrency world, which I find quite hilarious. Cryptocurrencies, if people accept them for transactions, then they've become money. This is Minsky's point. Anybody can create money. The hard part is getting it accepted. But my problem with the cryptocurrencies, there's two that I come down to. One is the fact that they based the controls over the multiple ledgers they created on energy consumption. So they're thinking they're going to use energy consumption in place of prudential regulations and bureaucrats making sure the transactions are valid. And I think that's a huge mistake, because we're seeing like it takes I think 10 minutes of computing power to generate what's called the nonce in a random system of validating the multiple ledgers of Bitcoin, and that meant that when it was peaking, you were getting Bitcoin alone using more energy than a country like Austria. But in terms of the number of transactions it was supporting, trivial, and mainly transactions. The main use of those transactions are criminal ones where you want to evade the private banking sector completely. So I don't see that being a technological revolution at all. And my other weakness about it is that when we hit the climate crisis that I'm expecting us to hit maybe in the next decade, maybe the next 2 decades if we're lucky, when that hits, you want to have a system where a government can control the assets in your system. And if it's going to be a cryptocurrency taking that place where people actually go for a Mad Max world and trade cryptocurrencies, they have to trust one of the cryptocurrencies. Now, how many are there? Last count I heard there were 17,000 cryptocurrencies. Which one do you trust? So the whole idea of trying to escape trust, I think, is impossible. You need to be able to say, I know this transaction will be trusted by everybody in the economic system which I'm a part of, whether that's Pakistan or Australia or India, et cetera, et cetera. So I think fiat currencies make more sense, particularly for when you want to start directing resources towards climate change adaptation, mitigation, when it becomes blatantly obvious we should have been doing it 50 years ago. you want to be able to marshal a country's resources to do that, and you won't do it using a cryptocurrencies, you'll do it using money. And the final thing on technology, by technology, what we normally mean is a means to exploit energy more effectively, more energy. You know, you go from a handheld toothbrush to an electric toothbrush, that sort of thing. We're going to go backwards for a while. We have to reduce our energy consumption. And so we won't be seeing the transformation of more energy and to get more GDP. We're likely to see a collapse in our usage of energy, and therefore we're going to go backwards in terms of the sophistication of the technology we use.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. This has been wonderful. And as I say, inshallah, we'll meet again and do this again. But thank you very much. Keep us very much in your file and keep PIDE informed. PIDE follows your work very carefully. PIDE is the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, which is a 70-year-old think tank, one of the first think tanks in the developing countries. And we try and keep ourselves updated, people like you, and try and find out what's happening. So thanks again, Steve. This has been wonderful. All the best to you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye, everybody.